The whispers started centuries ago, a low murmur questioning the integrity of a man celebrated as the father of history. Herodotus, a name synonymous with the birth of historical writing, has also been dogged by accusations of gullibility, a penchant for fantastical tales, and an unseemly fondness for foreign cultures. But what if these criticisms are not signs of weakness, but rather the keys to understanding his groundbreaking approach? What if the very things Herodotus was condemned for are the reasons his work remains relevant today? To understand Herodotus, we must journey back to his origins, to the vibrant and complex world of Halicarnassus, a city nestled on the southwestern coast of Asia Minor where the Aegean Sea kisses the rugged hills of Caria. It was here, around the beginning of the 5th century BC, that Herodotus was born, destined to become a pivotal figure in shaping how we understand the past. Halicarnassus was no ordinary Greek city. It was a melting pot of cultures, a crossroads where languages, myths, and ambitions collided. Founded by the Dorians and later falling under Persian rule, the city was a vibrant tapestry of influences. The local Greeks maintained their religious practices and customs, but their language absorbed Eastern loanwords. Their temples housed a mix of Olympian gods and Eastern deities, and the city's harbor bustled with Phoenician trading vessels alongside ships from the Aegean islands. In such an environment, childhood could not be confined to the narrow boundaries of a single culture or tradition. While details about Herodotus's early life are scarce, the spirit of the city and the era offer valuable clues. His family likely belonged to the affluent class. His father's name, Lixus, has been preserved in later sources, and it is believed that Herodotus's family may have been connected to the city's elite. This would have granted the young Herodotus access to education, libraries, and discussions about politics, religion, and ancient lore. He would have listened to the stories of traveling merchants and wise men who stopped in Halicarnassus on their way from Miletus, Rhodes, or even distant Syria. One of the earliest indications of his fascination with myth and memory can be found in the Halicarnassus theater, where tragedies were performed. Here, the young Herodotus may have listened to tales of Troy, Perseus, and the exploits of Heracles. However, oral storytelling likely had a more profound impact. Caria had a rich tradition of oral storytelling, with elders recounting battles in which their ancestors had fought, women singing songs about the gods in the marketplace, and priestesses preserving legends passed down through generations. It was within these oral traditions, filled with heroes, ghosts, omens, and memories of the past, that Herodotus likely took his first steps as a listener. Perhaps it was then that he developed the conviction that every event, whether a crime or a solar eclipse, deserved to be recorded, explained, and heard. But Halicarnassus was not just a birthplace, it was also a battleground. The city was ruled by a tyrant named Ligdames, appointed by the Persians. Despite his power, Ligdames was not popular among the citizens. His reign was marked by denunciations, exiles, and suspicions. According to one account, Herodotus's family was among those exiled, possibly due to political reasons or the involvement of a family member in resistance against the tyranny. Following their exile, Herodotus's family relocated to the island city of Thurii, which was later founded with Athenian participation. Before that, however, Herodotus may have spent some time on Samos, an island renowned for its wise men, navigation, and cultural independence. On Samos, he could have heard stories from sailors returning from the shores of the Nile or the cities of the Persian Empire. These tales may have ignited his passion for travel, a theme that would become central to his life. Halicarnassus remained with him not just as a geographical location, but as a starting point. It was the origin of a perspective devoid of fanaticism or narrow-mindedness. He did not consider his own culture to be the only correct one, nor did he view foreign cultures as barbaric in a derogatory sense. This perspective could only have been born in a cultural crossroads, in a childhood where the world was complex, multifaceted, and full of mysteries. When Herodotus later described Egyptian customs or Persian laws, when he attempted to understand why kings triumphed and why they fell, he would remember Halicarnassus. His hometown taught him the most important lesson: every nation has a memory, and if it is not preserved, it will disappear, along with those who once lived, loved, erred, and hoped. Perhaps that is why he eventually took up the pen, to prevent what he had heard in his childhood from fading into silence. When Herodotus left Halicarnassus, he left behind a city by the sea where he first heard stories worthy of preservation. But ahead lay a world full of mysteries, a world where every land held its own voice, its own tragedies, victories, and lessons. He set out not as a merchant, diplomat, or exile, but as someone seeking to understand. Where did peoples come from? Why do they live as they do? And what lies behind the stories that have been passed down through the ages from elders to youths, from warriors to priests, from sailors to philosophers? One of his first great journeys was to Egypt, a land that Herodotus described in extraordinary detail and where, by his own account, he spent a considerable amount of time. His visit likely occurred when Egypt was under the rule of the Persian king Artaxerxes I. Despite its political subjugation, Egypt retained a profound cultural identity, and Herodotus, fascinated by the antiquity of its civilization, sought to understand its structure, beliefs, and customs. He traveled to Memphis, the city that was once its capital, and to Thebes, where he was shown the great temples and colossi. He described priests who told him about generations of servants whose names were inscribed on the walls of the sanctuaries. He heard about kings, pyramids, gods with animal heads, mummification rituals, sacred animals, and the rigid hierarchy of Egyptian society. In his accounts, the Nile emerges as a divine source of life. He notes how Egyptians bake bread differently, wear clothes, and bury men and women, not as curiosities, but as subjects of fascinated study. Herodotus describes being shown secret passages and temple halls that were usually off-limits to foreigners, and being told about gods whose names were not spoken aloud. He became not an archaeologist in the modern sense, but he meticulously recorded what he saw and, especially, what he heard from local priests. Sometimes he doubted the veracity of the stories, but he always tried to preserve what he heard, not to condemn, but to transmit, even with reservations. From Egypt, his path most likely led east along the coast of the Levant. Herodotus mentions Tyre, the oldest city in Phoenicia, famous for its seafarers and colonies. In Tyre, Herodotus was told the story of how the Phoenicians, under the orders of an Egyptian king, once circumnavigated Africa, sailing south and east, and supposedly even saw the sun rising to the right of the ship, a detail that Herodotus, as an observant man, cited as an argument in favor of the authenticity of this seemingly incredible voyage. He also visited Syria, specifically Hierapolis, where he visited the sanctuary of the goddess Atargatis. There, he described the wealth of the temple, the priests with gilded staffs, the strange sacrifices, and the rituals that included self-castration, which aroused both horror and amazement among the Greeks. Herodotus did not seek to ridicule or denigrate these practices. On the contrary, he described with respect and interest what seemed foreign to his compatriots. Traces of his travels can be found in the north. Although Herodotus himself most likely did not reach the deep Scythian steppes, he visited the coastal Greek colonies in the Black Sea region. There, he met Hellenes living among the Scythians, merchants, former prisoners, and those who had heard and seen the customs of the nomadic tribes. He recorded their ideas about the afterlife, stories about the burial of leaders along with horses, servants, and treasures. He described their military organization, hunting, way of life, kinship ties, lack of writing, and ideas about medicine. His interest in the Scythians was not superficial. He attempted to form a comprehensive picture of a people whom the Greeks traditionally considered barbaric and savage, but who, in Herodotus's eyes, had their own coherent logic of life. One of the most enigmatic and impressive descriptions in his histories is the account of Olbia. Although Herodotus's contemporaries questioned his personal presence in this city, he provides information so detailed and vivid that it is difficult to believe he had not been there himself. Herodotus documents the walls with towers, the layout of the city. The world knew Herodotus as more than a mere traveler. He was an insatiable listener, a chronicler of human experience whose journeys were driven not by personal gain or political agenda, but by an unquenchable thirst for understanding. His path was one of constant observation, where temples gave way to bustling harbors, and the attire of people shifted from the familiar folds of Greek togas to the exotic allure of silken robes. He encountered societies where dogs were revered as sacred beings, while others held cows or rivers in similar esteem. His quest was not to find definitive answers, but to grasp the underlying reasons for the vast differences among people, and to recognize the common threads that bound them together: their shared fear of mortality, their yearning for recognition, and their innate desire to share their stories with the world. From the grand temples and bustling ports of Sidon to the humble tents of Scythian chieftains, from the vibrant marketplaces of Babylon to the serene boats gliding along the Nile, each experience became a building block in the foundation of his future work. Herodotus wasn't creating a map of the world in the geographical sense, but rather a map of human existence, charting its diverse beliefs, hopes, and delusions. As he embarked on his monumental task, Herodotus couldn't have foreseen that the historian proved initiating a new tradition of inquiry. He termed his endeavor historia, which in ancient Greek signified not simply the science of the past, but inquiry, investigation, and learning through asking questions. This definition encapsulates his approach perfectly. Herodotus sought to gather as many accounts of the past as possible, to ascertain who performed great deeds, when they occurred, and why. He then aimed to transmit these testimonies to future generations. His travels led him to converse with people from all walks of life: priests, officials, merchants, soldiers, and commoners. He listened intently, striving to convey what he heard with the utmost accuracy, while always indicating his level of confidence in the source. He distinguished between what he witnessed firsthand, what he heard from trustworthy individuals, and what was passed down as local lore. This meticulous categorization of sources was unprecedented at the time, making his work exceptionally valuable for subsequent generations. In Egypt, Herodotus, by his own account, spent a considerable amount of time. He visited temples, engaged in discussions with priests, and studied the prevailing beliefs, rituals, and history of the land. In Thebes, he became shown rows of statues, each purportedly representing a priest from a successive generation. Herodotus attempted to estimate the age of Egyptian civilization based on these traditions, and while he expressed skepticism about such antiquity, he nevertheless included the account without outright dismissal. His priority was not to prove or disprove, but to preserve the evidence. When Herodotus was told about Egyptian mummification practices, burial rituals, dietary habits, attitudes toward cats, or the construction of the pyramids, he refrained from imposing his own interpretations, but he also didn't transmit everything uncritically. He rejected claims that contradicted common sense. For instance, he dismissed the notion that the Nile's floods were caused by northern winds, and proposed his own, albeit naive, hypothesis. He wasn't a scientist in the modern sense, but Herodotus was the first to attempt to apply observation and logical analysis to the description of nature and customs. Even if some elements of his accounts were exaggerated or inaccurate, Herodotus's approach of documenting how people lived, thought, and explained the world was innovative and profound. A particularly noteworthy aspect of Herodotus's method was his treatment of myths. He neither dismissed myth as mere fabrication nor accepted it as literal truth. He presented legends, stories of gods, prophecies, and omens, but always made an effort to identify who told the story, where he heard it, and in what circles it was considered authentic. When writing about the Persians, Herodotus strived to maintain a balance between respect for their culture and objective analysis. He reported on Persian customs, such as teaching boys 3 things: to ride, to shoot, and to speak the truth, without adding his own judgments. He neither idealized the Persians nor denigrated them. The same applied to the Scythians. He described their way of life, traditions, and beliefs in detail, even though he likely never ventured deep into their territory. He relied on information obtained from Greeks living in the Black Sea colonies and from travelers who had interacted with the nomadic tribes. Herodotus almost always presented different versions of events if they existed. He described the death of Cambyses, the Persian king, based on several sources. One account claimed he accidentally wounded himself with his sword, while another claimed he was assassinated by conspirators. Herodotus presented both versions without asserting which was correct. This allowed the reader to form their own judgment, which was particularly significant in a culture where it was customary to either believe or disbelieve entirely. He wasn't afraid to engage in polemics with others. He respectfully quoted Homer but noted that the poet was likely mistaken in his descriptions of certain events. He became willing to argue with priests, traditions, and even himself, but never with mockery or disdain. Herodotus, unlike poets, didn't seek to elevate one thing and denigrate another. He attempted to present the entire spectrum, from sacred rituals to everyday habits, from mythical ancestors to royal courts. His method wasn't to impose a unified picture, but to show how complex and multifaceted the human world is. He created the first attempt to synthesize the experiences of different peoples, without reducing everything to a single culture, a single truth, or a single system of values. This is what made his approach revolutionary. He collected voices, recorded them where possible, clarified where he had doubts, and transmitted them where he couldn't judge. His work is not only a chronicle of events, but also a story about the human being himself, about how he learns, remembers, believes, and tells stories. When Herodotus began working on his project, he set himself the task of not only recounting the great war between the Greeks and the Persians, but also of finding out why it began, who was its true instigator, and how a series of seemingly minor conflicts led to a clash that engulfed almost the entire known world. He sought not only to preserve the memory of battles and heroes, but also to convey to his readers what he believed was behind the war, the offenses, resentments, mistakes, and decisions that led to the bloodshed. At the beginning of his histories, Herodotus turns to the distant past, to ancient legends of the abduction of women, of Io, Europa, and Helen. He cites myths in which some blame the Hellenes and others the Asians, and mentions that some people see these events as the first cause of enmity. However, he soon abandons the mythological version and begins to present the historical causes of the conflict. He considers the rise of the Lydian king Croesus to be the first real step. Croesus, who ruled in the mid-6th century BC, was known for his wealth, power, and interest in Hellenic culture. He conquered the Greek cities of Ionia, and for the first time placed the Greeks of Asia Minor under the rule of an Eastern sovereign. Herodotus recounts in detail how Croesus sent gifts to Delphi and how he consulted the oracle about the war with Persia, receiving the famous answer, "If you cross the Halys River, you will destroy a great kingdom." Croesus believed that this meant victory over the Persians, but after crossing the Halys, Herodotus was defeated by Cyrus the Great, thereby destroying his own state. After that, the Persians established control over the Greek cities of Asia Minor, and this became the first source of tension. A few decades later, the Ionian Revolt began. The satrap Artaphernes was strengthening Persian power in the region when the Milesian tyrant Histiaeus, having failed in an attempt to conquer the island of Naxos, tried to provoke a revolt in order to maintain his influence. He turned to the Greeks on the mainland for help and received support from Athens and Eretria. The combined fleet approached Sardis, the seat of Persian power in Asia Minor, and set the city on fire. Although no strategic success was achieved, the very fact of the Greek attack was an insult to Darius, and he vowed revenge. Herodotus emphasizes that this episode became the immediate cause of the beginning of the Greco-Persian Wars. Darius I, the great king of Persia, began preparations for a campaign against Hellas. The first detachment was sent under the command of Mardonius, but the fleet was wrecked off Cape Athos. 2 years later, a new expedition landed in Euboea and plundered Eretria, after which the Persian army approached Marathon. Herodotus describes how the Athenians, without waiting for help from the Spartans, moved to meet a much larger army and, under the command of Miltiades, won a victory. He tells of the construction of the Greek army, the lightning attacks of the phalanx, the closing. The naval clash at Salamis proved decisive. The Athenian strategist Themistocles, in a move of tactical brilliance, persuaded the allied Greek forces to engage the Persian fleet in the narrow straits, effectively nullifying the Persians' numerical advantage. Xerxes, positioned on the shore, witnessed the devastating defeat of his armada. In the aftermath of Salamis, Xerxes made the strategic decision to withdraw the bulk of his forces from Greece, leaving Mardonius in command to continue the campaign. The final major land battle unfolded at Plataea. Pausanias, the Spartan commander, led the combined Greek army against the remaining Persian forces. The death of Mardonius, the subsequent rout of the Persians, and the capture of their encampment marked the definitive end of the war on the Greek mainland. Almost simultaneously, across the Aegean Sea in Ionia, the Greek fleet achieved a resounding victory over the Persian naval squadron at Mycale. These twin victories, Plataea and Mycale, were viewed by Herodotus as symbolic of the restoration of Greek freedom and the resurgence of their autonomy. Herodotus doesn't shy away from highlighting moments of individual heroism and collective struggle. Herodotus relates the tense debates within the Athenian council, the wavering allegiances of the Thebans, and the treacherous inclinations of certain island city-states. His narrative reveals that warfare extends beyond the battlefield, encompassing internal divisions, fear, discord, and political maneuvering. Herodotus concludes his account not with a triumphal ode, but with a reflective contemplation on the capricious nature of human destiny. He demonstrates how victory doesn't always guarantee harmony, how defeat doesn't necessarily strip a people of their dignity, and how crucial it is to remember not only the celebrated heroes but also the underlying reasons that propelled them to such status. For Herodotus, the conflict between the Greeks and Persians serves not merely as a historical record but as a mirror reflecting the essence of power, the apprehension of freedom, the cost of alliances, and the magnificence of courage. Upon returning from his extensive travels, Herodotus's writings contained more than just a catalogue of kings and battles. They offered vivid portrayals of the diverse peoples he encountered or learned about through eyewitness accounts. These descriptions were far from neutral or impersonal. Instead, he endeavored to convey the character, customs, beliefs, and daily lives of each nation, integrating them into a comprehensive world picture where history comes alive through habits, gestures, words, and rituals. Herodotus dedicated a substantial and detailed section of his work to the Egyptians. His writings reveal with both admiration and astonishment a land where societal norms were often the inverse of those in Greece. Men engaged in weaving while women managed commerce, and meals were served in reverse order. Sacred animals received more reverence than many humans. He provides a particularly detailed account of Egyptian funerary practices, from the intricate process of mummification to the selection among 3 classes of burial depending on the family's financial resources. He also respectfully recounts the system of measurement and land redistribution following the annual Nile flood, where priests used ropes to re-establish property boundaries, which, in his view, led the Egyptians to lay the foundations of geometry and taxation. In these descriptions, Herodotus aims not only to impress with the exotic but also to convey a sense of an ordered, ancient, and distinctive world, where everything is governed by ritual, tradition, and a connection to the divine. Herodotus speaks of the Persians with respect. He emphasizes their strict adherence to honoring parents and elders, and their view of lying as a grave offense. The text presents instances where Persians, even when facing death, strove to maintain their dignity and uphold their customs. In describing their burial practices, he notes that Persians did not cremate bodies or bury them in the earth, so as not to defile the sacred elements of earth and fire. Instead, they placed the deceased in stone sarcophagi or left them on platforms for natural decomposition. Herodotus also draws attention to the Persians' openness to adopting foreign customs. He observes that they readily adopted the customs of other nations, clothing, foods, religious practices, if they deemed them worthy. He characterizes this approach as a sign of flexibility and an imperial mindset. The Persians were willing to incorporate anything useful into their culture without losing their own core identity. Herodotus pays particular attention to the Scythians, nomadic peoples from the northern Black Sea region, even though he likely never ventured far into the steppes himself. He gathered accounts from Greeks in Olbia and other coastal cities, and based on these, he described customs that would have seemed astonishing to his readers. He chronicles Scythian burial rituals, where, upon the death of a chieftain, the body was transported in a wagon from one tribe to another, with sacrifices made at each stop, including horses and servants, to accompany him in the afterlife. After weeks of traversing the territory, the body was buried in a kurgan, burial mound, and wooden idols and equestrian statues were erected above it. He notes that the Scythians had no writing system, but their memory was preserved through oral tradition, and prophecies were made by priestesses who divined using bundles of twigs and the movement of horses' tails. In his view, it was precisely this adherence to tradition and an independent way of life that made the Scythians so resilient and difficult to conquer. Herodotus speaks of the Lydians with respect, although he notes their fondness for pleasure. He emphasizes that it was in Lydia that coins made of gold and silver first appeared, standardized and accepted for exchange. He considers this innovation an important step in the development of trade and urban life. He also recounts the legend of a prolonged famine during which the Lydians supposedly invented dice, board games, and other amusements to distract themselves from their hunger. Herodotus presents this story as an example of the people's resilience and ability to find creative solutions. Herodotus observes the ancient migration of a portion of the Lydians, which supposedly led to the Etruscan culture in Italy. This hypothesis was considered plausible in antiquity, although modern archaeological evidence does not support it. Nevertheless, in Herodotus's account, the Lydians appear as an inventive, skilled, and industrious people who created a developed infrastructure and trade network, but lost their independence due to an overestimation of their own strength. Herodotus calls the Phoenicians skilled seafarers and traders. He notes how they, on the orders of the Egyptian pharaoh, circumnavigated Africa. In his accounts of the Phoenicians, he emphasizes their talent in creating purple dye, which was expensive and rare, as well as their skill in building ships capable of long voyages. He points out that the Phoenicians founded many colonies, including Carthage, and made a huge contribution to the spread of writing. Regarding the Babylonians, Herodotus recounts that in the city there was a custom by which a sick person would go out into the street and ask for advice from passers-by who had already experienced a similar illness. He also describes marriage customs, including the practice of marrying off beautiful girls for a dowry, and using the proceeds to arrange the fate of less attractive ones. This is an example of how, in his words, the structure of society can even out chance. Herodotus did not try to impose a single truth or judge peoples by their degree of civilization. He sought to show how differently people can live, believe, think, and feel, and how important it is to remember these differences. His observations are not an attempt to compile a list of curiosities, but a serious effort to understand how the world is arranged in all its human diversity. When Herodotus, already in adulthood, read excerpts from his history to the Athenian audience, the young Thucydides was, according to legend, present in the hall. The legend says that the historian proved so struck by what he heard that he wept. This image, more symbolic than historically reliable, became a sign of how ambiguously Herodotus was perceived even during his lifetime. Some saw him as a brilliant storyteller. Others, a dangerous fantasist whose texts cannot be separated from fiction. Herodotus himself, calling his work histories, emphasized from the very beginning that he wanted to preserve in memory the great deeds of both Greeks and barbarians, and to trace the reasons why peoples came to war. But it was precisely this desire for comprehensiveness and attention to foreign cultures that aroused irritation among Greek readers. Already in antiquity, Herodotus received the nickname Philobarbaros, friend of the barbarians. And in this word there was a reproach. He became not forgiven for describing with interest and sympathy the customs of the Persians, Egyptians, Phoenicians, and Scythians, often endowing them with virtues that the Hellenes traditionally considered their own. The reaction of the Athenians was especially ambiguous. Although Herodotus was influenced by Athenian culture, he did not hide the shortcomings in the actions of the Athenians in the Greco-Persian Wars, and sometimes even emphasized their indecision, political disputes, or tendency to self-will. This caused discontent among Athenian patriots, and according to some later evidence. In Alexandria, the chronicles of Herodotus became the subject of intense scrutiny, meticulous transcription, and widespread citation. Scholars dissected his itineraries, debated the size of armies he described, and argued over the precision of his geographical accounts. Yet, even the most exacting critics acknowledged that Herodotus was the first to attempt a comprehensive synthesis of human memory. He established a principle that would later become the bedrock of historical thought, that the same event can hold different meanings for different participants. During the Roman era, Herodotus remained a well-known figure, though his authority on matters of precise political detail diminished. Pliny the Elder, a figure known for his rigor, and other authors primarily referenced him as a source of ethnographic and natural observations. His descriptions of various peoples, their customs, the characteristics of animals, and unique climatic features were particularly popular. However, this period also saw the emergence of a trend to emphasize his penchant for the wondrous, his inclination to relay tales of miracles, rarities, and the unusual. Some Roman writers even expressed amusement at his perceived credulity. One of Herodotus's most vehement critics in antiquity was Plutarch. In his treatise on the malice of Herodotus, he accused him of bias, asserting that Herodotus was unfair to the Thebans and Corinthians. He alleged that Herodotus diminished the role of Athens, exaggerated the exploits of the Spartans, and generally placed too much faith in the accounts of others. This treatise, the only surviving detailed critique of Herodotus's histories from antiquity, reveals the seriousness with which his work was regarded, even 5 centuries later, despite its harsh tone. During the Byzantine era, Herodotus's works continued to be copied in monasteries, but interest in them shifted primarily towards philology. Herodotus was read as a classic of Greek prose, but rarely as a historian. Translations of his histories into Arabic were fragmentary and appeared late, and in Western Europe, he remained largely unknown until the Renaissance. The resurgence of Herodotus among a wider readership began in the 15th century with the advent of printed editions and Latin translations. Humanists celebrated his prose for its simplicity, clarity, and vividness. His approach was compared to the methods of new explorers, travelers, cartographers, and scientists. His work was seen not only as an ancient chronicle but also as a precursor to the Enlightenment's perspective on humanity. Thus, gradually, Herodotus secured a firm place in Western culture as the father of history. Although contemporary scholars approach his work with a critical eye, meticulously verifying facts, they acknowledge that he was the first to attempt to integrate causes, evidence, customs, geography, beliefs, and character into a single text. He became the first to transform human memory into a tool capable of explaining the world. By the time Herodotus completed his histories, he was already an adult. His name was known throughout the Greek world. He performed before audiences and interacted with educated people. Despite his prominence, his image remains hazy. No letters, personal notes, or reliable biographical information from contemporaries have survived. All that remains are speculations and later legends. The exact date of his death is also unknown. Most scholars believe that he died approximately 20 years after the end of the Greco-Persian Wars, which formed the basis of his work. If this date is correct, Herodotus would have been around 60 years old. The location of his burial is also unknown. Late antique authors mention a tomb of Herodotus in Thuria, but no archaeological evidence has been found. There is a story that shortly before his death, Herodotus read his entire work to the inhabitants of Thuria. Supposedly, some of those present heard for the first time how their people were described by a foreigner without mockery or humiliation. This tradition is unlikely to be documented accurately, but its symbolism is significant. Herodotus always sought to understand rather than judge, and if he indeed performed before different audiences, it is possible that this characteristic made his speech particularly valuable. Perhaps the last years of his life were the quietest. After decades of wandering, endless questioning, difficult roads, crossings, and sleepless nights spent over scrolls, he found himself in a city where there was no memory of war, where there was no pressure from his homeland, and where he could calmly complete his work. There is no evidence that he suffered from illness, nor are there any stories about tragic circumstances surrounding his death. He appears to have died of natural causes, which also held significance for the ancient world. The historian who collected stories about the deaths of kings, commanders, peoples, and civilizations himself passed away quietly. Late antique writers report that sometime after his death, the Thurians erected a monument to him. The authenticity of this claim cannot be verified. There is only a conjecture that his grave was indeed located within the city limits and that for a long time, it was visited not only by citizens but also by travelers from other polis. One text from the 4th century BC mentions that the Phoenicians later regretted their insufficient respect for Herodotus and supposedly erected a statue of him in one of the libraries. However, no inscriptions or architectural confirmations of this story have been found. What is known for certain is that after Herodotus's death, his work began to circulate in handwritten copies. He no longer performed in the agora, but his words continued to be heard. The text was passed from teacher to student, copied, cited, and discussed, and he himself, having left this world, continued to be present in the memory of Xerxes' campaign, in the descriptions of the rituals of Egyptian priests, in the stories of the burial of Scythian leaders, and in the debates about the fate of Croesus. Thus ended the life of a wandering historian, without apotheosis, without honors, without triumphs, but with a task accomplished. Herodotus collected the voices of the departed, made them audible, and conveyed what he considered most important, not one truth, but many testimonies, so that descendants could remember. Centuries passed, eras changed, empires crumbled, but the name of Herodotus did not disappear. It survived not because Herodotus was an impeccable chronicler or philosopher, but because he was the first to see in the stories of the past not just a sequence of events, but a way to understand humanity. His stories were passed down from generation to generation, first on parchment, then in rewritten scrolls, later in the first printed editions. And if today, more than 2,500 years later, he is still read, studied, and discussed, the reason lies not only in his historical value but also in the surprising humanity of his perspective. Already in antiquity, the attitude towards Herodotus was ambivalent. Some admired his storytelling ability, while others reproached him for his credulity. His text became a source of debate. Some saw in him a rich source of information about foreign peoples, others, a collection of wonders and speculations. During the Hellenistic period, his work was already perceived as a classic. Scholars in Alexandria studied his geographical descriptions, sometimes disputing his data, but acknowledging their significance. When the campaigns of Alexander the Great confirmed the existence of many peoples and lands described by Herodotus, interest in his work grew. His histories began to be seen as the first attempt to unite the world in words, not on a map, but in a story. The Romans read Herodotus with interest, but with a dose of skepticism. Cicero called him the father of history, not for his accuracy, but because the historian proved the first to transform the description of the past into a distinct literary genre. In the Middle Ages, interest in Herodotus waned. His texts were copied in Byzantine monasteries, but in the Christian world, he became perceived more as a writer of the ancient pagan tradition than as a source of knowledge. In the 15th century, his work was published in Venice in Greek, and Latin translations soon followed. Humanists turned to his texts as a model of prose and a testament to ancient thought. Later in Europe, Herodotus began to be compared to contemporary travelers like Marco Polo, Athanasius Kircher, and later, missionaries who described the peoples of Asia and Africa. His ethnographic sketches aroused new interest, and attempts to compare his information with real data revived both criticism and admiration. In the 19th century, with the rise of scientific historiography, Herodotus was again reproached for his trust in rumors, his lack of critical method, and his inability to construct a strict chronology. Thucydides, in the eyes of historians, became the model of scientific rigor, Herodotus, the model of a naive storyteller. But the more humanitarian science developed, the more Herodotus's own truth became apparent. He did not limit himself to politics, he looked at culture, customs, language, and everyday life. He tried to understand, not just explain. In the 20th century, especially after World War II, interest in Herodotus intensified.